Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies and International Baccalaureate High School in the Bronx.
I'm Nique, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI and an adjunct professor at Rice Business School and the WashU Business School.
Nique, as always, great to see you. Our followers typically see us interview someone who we're trying to create greater awareness of their work. But today's episode is actually a conversation between you and me. And this one might get personal because we're both husbands, we're both fathers of daughters. Unfortunately, the data has come out recently again that shows that for Black women having children in the United States, consistently 70% of those births are outside of marriage. And it's really amazing because it's not as if the number of births in a given year has to mimic the year before or the number of non-marital births, but just
Right.
consistently the number is about 70%, 7 out of 10 Black babies born outside of marriage. And actually for Black women 24 and under, that number is more than 90% nationwide. So the numbers are just staggering. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that because, we both have aspirations that both of our children, boys and girls, we want them to lead wonderful lives, and hopefully that will include marriage. And you've written a very provocative piece on your Substack. What kind of men are good enough for our daughters? So, Nique, I ask you, what kind of man is good enough for your daughters?
Well, thank you, Ian. The subheadline on that article is "He better be ready to take a bullet for them," and that's a bit obnoxious, but it's sincere and from my heart because I do believe that one of the fundamental responsibilities that a man had is to protect their family. We have this testosterone, we have these muscles, we have this strength for a purpose, and one of those purposes are to protect. And so, in the article, I go through. I have sort of a mix of
toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity.
Well, yeah. I mean, if that's what they label it today, I can remember my father. Anytime there was an issue, we were in the car and someone wanted to make trouble, he took action. It made us feel safe and kept us safe. And he used to have a stick in his car, a large stick, and he called it his directional signal because anytime someone got in his space, he would use that stick to send them in a different direction. And I treasure that, and I value that, and I appreciate Dad for doing that.
Yeah,
and I don't think that goes away in 2025.
No, not at all. I mean, I concur. Like, I think about my own father for sure. But I think, one characteristic I'd like of a man who's, courting my daughter is someone who grew up in a healthy family himself, with two married parents. You obviously can't have the ideal all the time, but I certainly would want the man interested in my daughter. And by the way, if my daughter's listening, this is for many years from now. You're way too young now. But someone who's at least seen and experienced a healthy relationship. Someone who's been at the knee of a good husband and a good father.
100%. 100%. I mean, it's common sense and it's logical. People mimic what they see. When we think about, the times of segregation, talk about the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, where we made some of our greatest leaps forward in terms of our educational attainment, our ability to launch businesses. Part of that strength was from the fact that we were segregated and we saw one another and we saw the best of us next to each other. We knew that there was the doctor that lived next door. We knew that there was the dentist that lived next door, or the business person. and that provided role modeling. So to your point, someone that is interested in your daughter, doggone it, they should have been brought up in an environment where they had wonderful role models, both from a father and a mother.
And by the way, when you talk about the early 1900s, 1910s, 20s, 30s, that's when the black family had the highest marriage rates. It's actually people, we talk about so much the non-marital birth rate in the black community today being 70%, and these numbers and the all the stereotypes of black men, the stereotypes of them having multiple children. That wasn't the case in the early 1920, 1930. In fact, if you look at the data, the marital rates in the black community exceeded that of the white community. And indeed, in there's a very famous report, the Moynihan report, which was written in 1964, 65. And Moynihan was making the case that he was seeing this trend in the black community, that there was a thriving middle class, and yet there was this stubborn segment of the black community. And he said he talked about slavery and this legacy of slavery, but that this issue of non-marital births would become its own negative, self-perpetuating force. And the non-marital birth rate in the black community, when he wrote that, was 23.6%. Can you imagine if we were able to attain that level today? And at the time, he was saying this is a crisis.
Well, I mean, you as an engineer, the mathematics of that are so exciting because from your book, your most recent book, the data is clear. If the number was 23%, we can back our way into what the economic picture for Black America would be, what the entrepreneurial picture of Black America would be, what faith would represent for Black America. I mean, it would be
Yep.
it would be magnificent.
It was, in fact, there was a study a few years ago. Brad Wilcox at Institute for Family Studies produced a study, and it was called "Black Men Making It in America." And the reason I found it such an interesting study is that most of the time that you see any research on black men, it's almost always focused on the stigma, the non-marital birth rates, all the negative, the incarceration rates. And so this study does what I like to do, which is that, well, if there's a negative story in one segment, there's got to be some positivity elsewhere. And can we understand the positivity? We need to be as obsessed with success as we seem to be with failure. And in this study, Black Men Making It in America, they broke down, well, what were the factors? Was it just random? Are all these guys just lucky? Were they all just LeBron James and they all had the ability to play basketball? Or were there other factors? And as it turned out, these black men who made it into the middle class or beyond usually had benefited from some kind of strong education, whether it be through school choice or otherwise. They almost always got married and had children within marriage. They almost always had a personal faith commitment. And in this case, a good chunk of them also served in the military.
Interesting.
So just very interesting amongst black men. And our listeners should check it out, Black Men Making It in America. But, it's not a mystery. And by the way, those four things that I just said, they're not specific to black people, right? If you get an education, personal faith commitment, marriage, then children within marriage, usually good things are going to happen for you and your children.
Those principles are hardwired into so many cultures that exist in America. It's not even optional. It's a given. But something you said, Ian, so powerful. And I think it speaks to one of the greatest failures of the media today. The emphasis on the negative and almost zero focus on the positive. Anytime something bad happens, it is a multiplier of 1,000 is put against it. It is cast about. The worst possible clickbait titles are put against it. The positive doesn't exist. Even when there is a positive, it's in the context. I'll take an example. I'll give you an example of a positive, right? Some young boy who works at a restaurant and has to walk 6 miles a day to get to the restaurant, and he's always on time, and someone gives him a car.
Right.
That's okay. It's nice. It's a wonderful gesture, and God bless that young man for having that discipline. But there are tens of thousands of positive stories of men of every race doing the right thing
Yeah.
every day for their
Yeah.
families, for their mates, for their spouses. It never gets presented.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a few years ago, I wrote a piece called "The Other Michael Brown." Right. And if I say the name Michael Brown, what do you think of?
St. Louis, riots, a false narrative from the media about what happened.
Right. Right. That Michael Brown, 17, 18-year-old kid, unfortunately died in this interaction with a white police officer. And as you say, a narrative was built around that. But as it turns out, there is another Michael Brown. And it's interesting, his Michael, the A and the E are flipped in his spelling. But that Michael Brown got into about 20 different colleges and universities, ultimately attended Stanford University, from
Wow.
Texas. So almost the same exact age as the other more well-known Michael Brown, but the Michael Brown of Ferguson basically eclipsed any kind of knowledge of the Michael Brown of Texas who got into 20 different universities. And the thing is, there is this duality, although there's far more many Michael Browns that went to Stanford than there are Michael Brown that was killed in this interaction with the police.
Yes.
But as you say, the balance of awareness, and it's not unintentional. It's almost as if these folks want to preserve the narrative.
That's
They
right.
want the Michael, the media, larger forces, they want this narrative of black man as endangered species, a victim of hostile police. Meanwhile, the number of rising black men is not to be ignored. And most importantly, what's not to be ignored are the elements that drive the success of someone like the Michael Brown who got into 20 different colleges and universities.
It's a wonderful point. I went back to our business school, Harvard Business School, last April for a conference, and I was sitting next to a gentleman who was he was about 10, he graduated 10 years earlier than us. And we were chatting, and he shared a story that from 1982 approximately to the end of the 80s, there were something like 2 to 3 black men that had achieved Baker Scholar status at Harvard Business School. Baker Scholar status being top 5%. But the narrative doesn't end there because he said he just got data from the dean's office that, and I may have my years off, but in 2023, there were 5 Baker Scholars who were African American in that single year. That's a major accomplishment.
Yep.
And there's lots of reasons why that occurred, but again, it's a narrative that will never be delivered because people want it to still be the 1980s, where, let's be honest, it was a more hostile campus for
Yep.
non-white males.
But
But
what
things have changed.
but what do you think holds black middle and upper class people who've been successful, who have gotten married, who've gotten their education, who have a personal faith commitment, who lead their lives with integrity and strong morality? What do you think it is of that community that doesn't repudiate these stereotypes when they come forward? I think Shelby Steele and others. I think they sometimes refer to as like black guilt. Like it's almost as if there's I don't know, like imposter syndrome, something that you almost tolerate these ideas when it's so clear that the decisions you made in your own life are the reasons for your success, and we should be preaching what we have practiced in our own lives.
It's a wonderful question. It's a critically important question. And I think, the answer varies. But if I think about so many examples where someone stands up in front of an audience, tells their life story, of what they've accomplished. And 99.9% of the time, it's through grit, determination, never giving up. And then they pivot to how difficult and unfair and racist this society is. And it just, those two things don't match.
Right.
Because if you could do it, if you could overcome and have this incredible success, then why are we focusing on the things you did to be successful versus the obstacles that may
Right.
have been in your way?
Right. I mean, on this point, I actually have some empathy for those folks who say, "Well, why is it that you've got to have grit and all that?" So I actually try to focus on, okay, yes, you certainly had grit, you certainly persevered under tough circumstances, but what gave you that? And almost always they had someone in their corner, you know? Hopefully, it was a mother and father who pushed them, right? Or they went to a great school and they had teachers that backed them, or they had a personal faith commitment, and it was the being part of a religious community that really drove them. And so I try to say, you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to, pull yourselves up, by your proverbial bootstraps, right? But there is an element of your own self determination, but that's why I wrote my book, Agency. This is why I talk about family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. That even if you're in a tough circumstance, you're not doomed, you know. And so often I just feel like there's this narrative that wants to feed this idea that your outcomes, particularly if you're a young black kid, that your outcomes are predetermined. But let's go back to your original, because I want you to lay out some of the other characteristics that you, because this is the environment that a lot of young black men and women, and by the way, I presume race is not necessarily one of your factors for what has to be an element, a characteristic of someone who would be good enough for your daughter. But what were some of the other things that you laid out would be important to you for your daughters?
Yes, and race was not on my must have list, nor was religion. On the must have list, respect. It's an obvious thing, but yet not so obvious in this society today. You look at the amount of pornography that has pervaded society. My son told me recently that something like 30% of all the bandwidth on the internet is used to push pornographic content around the internet.
Right.
Uh, Obviously, incredibly unhealthy, incredibly destructive, very much anti-women. And so respect, if I don't know what percent of young men have a porn addiction or gravitate to that kind of content, but it creates unhealthy connections in the mind. And so that respect is a very core and fundamental thing. And again, you talk about faith-based. Faith can have a significant influence on that. The next item was loyalty. Again, these are such obvious, basic things, but they're clearly not present often enough in relationships today. And so, we look at, again, what gets spotlighted, over and over, whether it's athletes, entertainers, or even entrepreneurs having 3, 4, 5 baby mamas,
Oh,
having literally a dozen kids.
yeah, Cam Newton was just celebrated. I think he's 7 or 8 kids, and he wanted more. And it didn't.
Elon Musk, I believe, has 12 children with 3 women. And I get the whole birth rate. People talking about birth rate is so important,
Yeah,
but
he's single-handedly trying to solve the birth, the
so
fertility.
loyalty is a thing. Like, I certainly don't want one of my daughters to be a part-time side piece for someone that's going around collecting trophies in the form of women. That's disgusting and unacceptable.
Right. And we also don't want our sons to be that guy, right? So this, and
100%.
this goes both ways. I wonder how do you think, so I mean, online, the pornography for sure, but how do you think social media is affecting all of this? Because it used to be, there's this great chart that came out, I think out of Stanford, that showed how heterosexual couples met each other over the last 70, 80 years. And it's this really amazing chart where it shows,
I've seen
it
that
starts
chart.
off, you usually met through your family, or your church or your work and all these different and that was at the high level, and then obviously online was zero in
Yes.
1940s. But as this chart goes to the right and it goes up in years, the online literally it's almost 80% now. And things like meeting your future mate through family or faith or work or school, it's infinitesimal. How do you think that's playing out in this? Because kids aren't courting in the same way. Young men aren't learning how to, ask that girl for the, their first date, or I don't know. You've done all this kind of what's the right word? You've done all this analysis through Tinder or the other things, and yeah. So I'm curious how does social media play into this? Do you think?
Well, another piece that I'm writing is about the death of patience. And as you talk about getting up the nerve to ask a young lady to go out and speak, going back a few more generations, asking the parents for the permission to
Right,
young lady.
right.
There's a process, and now it's almost instantaneous. And it's not just instantaneous in terms of these apps, but then the instantaneous and transactional nature of intimacy, right? I
Mm,
mean, at some point, if you pull up some of those charts, I'd imagine that intimate relations between man and woman that those have also probably gone up in a similar fashion with online, or even maybe sooner. But um, yeah, there's a loss of patience, and the courtship is a thing,
right.
and it's lost. So we talk about hookup culture and all that. As you know, Ian, my wife is born and raised in Sudan, and one of the things I absolutely love about the culture, absolutely love, is when it comes to relationships and the importance of the two things you said, family and faith. That those two things play a role as your children look to find a mate. That
Mhm.
there's a family conversation. Who is that family?
Yes. No,
Uh,
absolutely. My, when my parents started courting in Jamaica, many years ago, my dad used to pick my mom up on dates on horseback, in the
Incredible.
country. Isn't that beautiful? This is
It's
beautiful imagery.
absolutely beautiful.
And at the time, Jamaica was an English Commonwealth, and my dad felt he'd hit his sort of apex in terms of what he could do educationally. So he went to London to pursue his education, but then started missing my mom. They called each other buds. They used to write each other. And he wrote a letter to her parents in this small little town in Lewis, Jamaica, for her hand in marriage. He wrote, and that caused much consternation in the Sivrite household. But this idea, and ultimately, they gave her permission to say yes, and so
Incredible.
she took a boat all by herself, 5,000
Incredible. I
miles.
never knew this story.
Yeah,
Incredible.
yeah, from Jamaica to London. She took a boat, and then they got married in London. They had my brother. Then 7 years later, they had me. But yeah, there was this idea that you had to go through her parents
That's right.
to and demonstrate that you were worthy. I
That's
mean,
right.
what's the kind of man I want that's good enough for my daughter? I want him to demonstrate that he's worthy, that he knows that this is someone that he's asking to spend the rest of his life with, who is of reverence. It's someone who you not only love, but you almost have some awe. Which is a
Yes.
beautiful thing. Which is a beautiful thing.
100%. 100%. And by the way, how long were they married?
They were married for 48 years before my dad passed away. And my wife, her parents have both still alive, have now been married 56 years.
God bless.
It's an amazing thing. In popular culture, it's still the case that The Cosby Show was the last time that a major television show had a 50th wedding anniversary featured
Oh,
on an episode. This was back in the 80s. So even from a pop culture perspective, we're not seeing really healthy, long marriages. And all that is reflected on young people today. You know, because a
one
lot of young people they will rather say there's some data that shows this. They would rather say that they would be willing to have a child out of wedlock than necessarily getting married. Just very interesting, right?
yes, it
That
is.
it used to be that marriage was a cornerstone, on the way to a better life. You start your education, you'd court, you'd get married, then you'd have kids. Now, marriage is not necessarily a part of the picture, or it's further down the road, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen before children.
100%. And if you push too hard on those buttons, people really get offended, and they call you all sorts of names for setting unreasonable goals. I'll tell you, I have the entire collection of Cosby Show episodes, and my oldest daughter, and I mean this, it is her favorite show. She has watched every episode. She still goes back to it at 19.
Wow.
She loves it. She absolutely loves it. And I know it's gonna have some impact when she becomes a mom. I'm sure she'll reflect on the beauty of that show and the relationships
Oh
with
yeah.
the.
Well, remember when Obama first got elected, there was a whole narrative that part of the reason people felt comfortable voting for him as the first black president was that it was a generation who had been raised with the Cosby Show as an extremely popular show. So the idea of a professional black couple, she was, I think, a doctor. Well, he was a doctor, and she
She
also
was a lawyer.
she
She
was a
was a lawyer.
lawyer. Yeah, and they had great kids and this very stable home. That kind of normalized this idea, huh? You know, and so it's not out of whack at all.
My last must-have is again somewhat silly, but they need to be willing to do the ugly work. I about a year ago I just started reflecting on telephone poles and ditches and oil refineries and fishing vessels,
How about
all these
How about firefighting?
firefighting, all these things that are mostly done by men. Not firefighting has changed a bit, but we had a flood at the house, and a guy came out, and we had to end up going into the backyard, and he pulled up this cover, and there was a tunnel, and all these bricks around it. And I said, my God, a bunch of men got down into the mud and brick by brick built this infrastructure that's so important to how America runs.
Hmm.
So I think about that ugly work, and I think I want men that are willing to do the ugly work. And so it's not just about digging that ditch, but it's also about, when I got married, I could not put together a piece of IKEA furniture to save my life, and I couldn't stand doing it. But you know what? That's the ugly work that has to get
There
done.
you go. IKEA won't be sponsoring us anytime soon. I hear you, my friend. Well, excellent. Well, we got to be willing to do the dirty work, the ugly work, and we just want to inspire the rising generation to see the value, the happiness that comes along with respect, loyalty, all the things that you're talking about for our daughters and our sons.
100%, my brother. 100%.
All right. Well, excellent. Well, Nique, thank you as always for another great episode of The Invisible Men, special edition, with our discussion with each other. And if you'd like to see additional episodes of The Invisible Men, please go to www.invisible.men. And with that, Nique, as always, great to see you.
Thank you, Ian. Same.